Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jake Wynn, Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, coming at you for another live video being hosted by the museum. We have been doing these videos for the last couple of months and really excited to have you all here if you're joining in on the conversation. Again, my name is Jake Wynn. I'm joined today by my colleague, our Membership and Development Coordinator, Kyle Dalton. Hi, Kyle. How are you?
Hey, everybody. Doing pretty good on my end here. I hope everybody's staying safe and healthy out there.
Excellent. I'm holding down the fort here in Washington, D.C. Kyle is just up the road in Frederick, Maryland. And joining us from Ithaca, New York is our guest today, historian Jonathan Jones.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, thanks for being here. This is a conversation that we have been excited about having for a long time. Jonathan did speak at the museum, I think back in 2017.
Yeah,
it feels like 100 years ago.
Yeah.
At this point. And it was a great presentation then, and Jonathan's research has gotten even deeper and has gone lots of other places since then. And so we're really excited to have this conversation today, talking about opiates in the Civil War era. So these videos that we have been doing, as I see people checking in from all over the place, thank you all so much for joining us today. If you are just joining us, please let us know where you're from in the comments. Always fun to watch people commenting from all over the country and around the world. People coming in, I can see right now from Tulsa, Oklahoma, Maine, West Virginia, New Jersey. We had on our last couple of videos, folks tuning in from Russia, Lithuania, England. It's been amazing to have this kind of conversation with folks all over the world. And the chat feature, as you can see in the corner of your videos, depending on where you're watching, if you're watching on your phone, I think you have to swipe over for the comments. If you're on a browser, on your laptop like we are today, it's over in the corner. Please drop a note. Let us know where you're watching from. And if you have any questions or comments as our conversation is going today, please feel free to drop those questions and comments in there. It helps to get a conversation going, and that allows more people to engage in the research, the scholarship that we're talking about today, to learn more about what interests you. If you are really enjoying the videos that we've been doing, you can help us reach more people. You can hit the like button on the video. You can react to the video, so you can give us a heart, or the new one, you can give a caring that you care about us, or like somebody did on the last video, you can give us an angry emoji. I'm sure that I earned that somehow. You can also help us by sharing the video. It allows more people from your networks out there all around the country and around the world to join in with us and become part of this conversation. And then take it to the next level. If you want to, and you want to support these videos in a way with some financial backing, you can become a donor or a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. You're going to find a link for that in the comment thread here in just a bit, where you can click and become a member or a donor, and that allows you, yes, you out there, wherever you're watching from, to support our efforts, to support these digital history initiatives that the museum has been putting on. You support the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and you allow us to continue doing this work. And then, once we all get back to life as we knew it before the pandemic, you can come and visit the museum, and you get all kinds of awesome perks that come with being a member and a supporter of our institution. And we're going to be continuing to do these videos for the next couple of weeks, probably months. We're going to continue doing these videos in the future. So no matter where you're watching from, by becoming a member or donor, you're supporting these kinds of efforts. So thank you all for watching today with us. And I hope you're going to enjoy the conversation to come. I believe wholeheartedly that you will. And I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan now. Jonathan, I've gotten to talk with you and work with you and share some of the museum's resources with you over the last couple of years. But if you could let our audience know out there, and we have about 83 people watching right now, which is great. Let our audience know a little bit about who Jonathan Jones is and how he got interested in Civil War medical history.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a PhD candidate in the history department at Binghamton University, and I'm actually almost through with my PhD. So here in just a couple of weeks, I will defend my dissertation, and then I'll be Dr. Jones, which is so crazy to think about. But as long as I can really remember, I was always interested in the Civil War. My parents would, when I was a kid, my parents would like take me to Civil War reenactments and buy me, Civil War books. So I was kind of a Civil War buff, if you want to call it that. And like a lot of people, as a kid, I was really into like Civil War military history, right? So I would like play. There were back in the '90s, there were like PC computer games that you could buy and sort of like fight your way through the Civil War. So I remember playing those as a kid, and so my interest in Civil War history kind of grew from there. I did my MA, my master's degree at another university at TCU in Texas. And when I was working on my master's thesis there, it started out as kind of a military history project that veered in some different directions. And one of those directions was the history of Civil War medicine, basically. So the project, I was looking at Civil War veterans' post-war lives, like what happened to them after the Civil War. And I kept finding cases of Civil War veterans that became addicted to morphine. And at the time, I just kind of filed that away as like a curiosity piece. I have like a file, everybody does, but I have one of these long lists of files of like projects I want to do in the future. And this morphine angle went onto that list. And luckily, when I started my PhD at Binghamton, I got to come back and work on that project. So always been interested in the Civil War, and over the last few years, I've moved towards the medical history of the Civil War, which showcases so many different aspects of the war that you only get sort of glimmers at in the military history of the war.
Now, quick follow-up question. What video games did you play as a kid that got you interested?
Yeah, there used to be this game called Sid Meier's Gettysburg and Sid Meier's Antietam.
I remember those. Yeah.
They're really fun to play at least. They're really interesting takes on the Civil War because they totally ignore the causes of the Civil War. There's no slavery in them, but it is a really fun way to sort of immerse yourself into the Civil War's military history. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's no, if I'm remembering the games correctly, there's no like dying. So it's kind of like a sanitized version of the war, but they are fun. There was another game called, oh gosh, it escapes me. I think it was called like Grant Lee Sherman Civil War Generals.
Oh yeah, that was the Sierra Online turn-based. Yeah, and the first one was Robert E. Lee Civil War General. And then Generals was the sequel.
Right. Yeah, and that game was my jam. I
can still hear the bad music on the background.
Yeah, my computer would never load the video cutscenes, so every time one of those would come up, it would crash.
Well, I guess we should probably get back on topic. So before we get into the bits and pieces of this, I do want to make sure our audience knows we are not medical professionals. Nothing we say should be taken as medical advice. This is a medical history program. We want to entertain you. We want to inform you, but we're not doctors. Well, not doctors of medicine. So please don't take any of this as medical advice. Having said that, what are the types of opium that were available in the period? Because opioid is a big category.
Right. Yeah. So opioid, there are, scores and scores of different versions of opioids, which is sort of like an umbrella term for a group of medicine. In the last few decades, there have been sort of what are called synthetic opioids. Things like OxyContin, for example, is one of the more widely known ones. Those did not exist during the Civil War era. Those are a relatively new innovation in the sort of the longer history of opium. Opium itself, which is derived from the poppy plant, is as old as human. I hate to say like big sort of sweeping statements like this, but it's one of humankind's oldest drugs. It's been around for thousands and thousands of years. There was a team of scientists a few years ago that tried to determine how long humans had been making opium medicine. And so they tried to search for wild versions of the opium poppy, and they couldn't find any, which is just always like a stunning fact for me. Every version of opium is a cultivated version, meaning that humans have been growing it and sort of cultivating its medical properties for thousands of years. If you read ancient Greek medical texts, they write about opium and its like pain relieving properties. And you can follow that thread through like medieval Europe, all the way up into the 1820s and 1830s United States. The main varieties back then were what was called gum opium, which is basically just like the most raw medicinal version of opium that you can get. It's sort of this like, almost like a brown or black kind of paste that you can then turn into other kinds of medicine. So people would turn those into pills. They would mix them with other kinds of drugs. One of the more common ones was a medicine called camphor. So you could stick that together in a pill and you could take that for various things. Around the time of the Civil War, morphine, or what they used to call it at that time, more commonly, they called it morphia. It was becoming more and more popular. It was discovered in the early 1800s, and it took a while to catch on. And during the Civil War, American doctors started injecting morphine. So there's essentially sort of the opium pills, injectable morphine, and also there was a liquid mixture of opium and alcohol called laudanum. Those were the big three.
All right, we happen to have a couple of reproductions here that we use for educational purposes. So I know these vials were sometimes carried into the field in the form of morphine. We've got our powdered opium,
yes,
also carried in very similar vials, and the opium pills. You see that has the Latin you were talking about. They usually referred to these by their Latin name rather than the common ones that we use.
So I feel like I have to jump in here and say, as you jumped in, Kyle, and said we're not medical professionals, I'll jump in and say that's not real opiates.
No.
It's not like Kyle has a secret stash hidden away in his apartment somewhere in the city of Frederick.
So those are the types that were available. That brings us to some of our other questions here. And again, if anybody has questions, you can post those questions at any time. I can't see them. Jonathan can't see them. Jake can see them though. Jake will pass on the questions that you ask in the comments. We have a few of our own that we'll continue to go through. So when did opioid usage become like the go-to? Was it always the go-to for the US? And what was it used specifically to treat?
That was actually one of my biggest questions when I started this project. I knew that after the Civil War, going into the project, I knew that in the post-Civil War decades, that addiction was a big problem, especially among veterans. But I wanted to know like how far into the past that problem extended. So I did some digging, and as best I can tell, as far as, so there are traces in the sort of historical medical records dating from the early United States, like all the way back into the 1770s, 1780s, that sort of hint at opiate addiction. So for example, Crevecoeur, this I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, but this like French guy who's famous for like traveling around the early United States and writing about what he saw. He observed women in Nantucket who he described as like being too fond of opium, right? So to me, that screams like, you know, they're habituated to opium. But opiate addiction wasn't seen as like a really serious medical problem until the 2 decades prior to the American Civil War. So the 1840s and 50s is really when it became a noticeable medical problem in the United States. It was, there's a couple of reasons why. The first one is that as sort of global, as the US really became in the early 1800s enmeshed into global trade, especially with places in Asia, that heightened the flow of opium around the world. So there was simply more opium floating around in the antebellum United States than there ever had been before. So more people were able to take it and get it, and that led to higher rates of addiction. Another reason is cholera, epidemic cholera. In the 1830s and 40s, as cholera became something that the American medical profession was really concerned with, various remedies were floated for cholera, and opium was one of the major ones that doctors used. So I think that led to sort of the earliest glimmers of opiate addiction in the US as being like a big problem.
So it's used to treat cholera in the period.
Yeah.
Not today, I assume. What are some of the other conditions that opioids would be used for?
Yeah, this blows my mind. We think of morphine and opioids today as primarily painkillers, and they were used for that, particularly hypodermic morphine during and after the Civil War. But actually, the major use of opium and its derivatives during the 19th century was actually to control diarrhea, believe it or not. And that was one of the most surprising things for me when I started on this project. I expected to find much more like stuff on the pain side of things, but I ended up finding a lot of people that suffered from really severe diarrhea. They would take opium pills to control the diarrhea. Opium actually does, I guess to put it mildly, like does stifle diarrhea. So it was a really common anti-diarrheal treatment for decades and decades in the 19th century. And that led a lot of people to become addicted to it. It was also, I mean, I actually at one point sat down and counted in 19th century medical journals the number of things that opium was prescribed for, and I stopped counting at 150 different ailments. So, I mean, things like it was prescribed for like rabies, tuberculosis, coughing. They would give it to occasionally they would give it to babies that were teething to numb the teething pain. So you name it, they prescribed opium for it.
So they're using it for a lot of different conditions. There's presumably a ton of it coming into the country and being used. So they're recognizing, though, that there is an opioid addiction well, I don't know if it's an epidemic before the war, but they recognize it as a problem, as you said. So do doctors during the Civil War have any compunction about prescribing it? Are they starting to question or get hung up on whether they should be handing out as much as they are?
Yeah, so going into the Civil War, doctors knew that opiate addiction was a consequence of taking opium and opiates for too long, right? It had never reached, before the Civil War, it never reached epidemic levels. So it was something that happened to some people, and doctors were alarmed about it, but it hadn't reached sort of that point where it became like a news cycle item, right? You don't see a lot of media coverage about opium addiction or an opioid crisis before the Civil War. With that said, doctors, army surgeons knew that opiates were addictive, and some of them did worry about the consequences of just handing out opium pills and morphine to soldiers, right? Because they knew that if soldiers kept taking them for a certain amount of time, that they might become addicted to it. The problem is that opiates were essentially the only effective painkillers and antidiarrheals that Civil War surgeons had, right? So even though they knew that the drugs were addictive, they really didn't have any other better, more effective medicines. So they sort of just had to bite the bullet and prescribe them. But yeah, you see if you read Civil War era medical journals that were published during the Civil War, around 1863, 64, you start to see warnings about opiate addiction being published in those journals.
How aware do you think the soldiers were of the risks? And did they really get any choice in whether or not they were prescribed that?
That's a good question. I think so often, at least I was guilty of this when I started the project. So often when we think about medicine and like the history of medicine, we think about doctors. Like, what did doctors do? What did doctors think? But you know, a medical encounter is like a two-way thing. You've got the doctor and the patient, right? So Civil War. So I started as I was writing my dissertation manuscript, I started thinking about sort of like, what did the soldiers think about opium? And so when I started digging around in soldiers' letters and diaries, I started to realize that soldiers also, many soldiers wanted opium, which they knew worked, right? So they were, army camps were pretty filthy. They were, you know, if you spent a lot of time in them, you were prone to contracting diarrhea or various different diseases. And so soldiers also knew that opium worked. And they went out of their way, many of them, to try to get opium to treat themselves, to self-medicate. So for example, I found this, there's this one soldier that was imprisoned at Andersonville, a Union soldier named George Naylor, who sent a letter to his parents back home. I think they were in Vermont or someplace up in the Northeast, asking them to send him a vial of laudanum so that he could medicate himself for diarrhea at Andersonville. And you see various examples of that in soldiers' letters and diaries during the Civil War. They
So
also go ahead.
Yeah, so we have a comment here about your the use of the term "bite the bullet," which I thought was fantastic for talking about Civil War medicine.
Yeah.
So that brings up to me just the reference there, and we're talking about kind of some of the usages of opium during the war. We know we've talked about this, and Kyle did a whole video about this with anesthetic in the war and its use. 95% of surgeries are done using some form of anesthesia. And another part that we often talk about when we talk about things like serious surgical operations or amputations during the Civil War is the use of painkillers in conjunction with those surgeries. So Jonathan, can you talk about kind of the intersection of where your research into opiates in the Civil War kind of comes up against surgical history, amputations in the conflict.
Yeah, I think of it sort of like this. If you were a Civil War soldier going through an amputation, you would more than likely be given chloroform in the moment to sort of take care of your pain during the surgery. But after that, then you would be given the opium or the morphine. So they sort of go together. You've got your chloroform during the surgery, your opium afterward to relieve the pain, the lingering pain from your surgery or your gunshot wound or whatever kind of pain that you're suffering from. So that's sort of where it goes into it. But the interesting thing for me is not that opiates were used, not just that opiates were used to treat pain, but what that meant for the people that were being given the opium, right? Because pain is, it's not just a medical phenomenon. It's also something that has a lot of cultural baggage that goes along with it. Right. So in the 19th century, men were expected to sort of just like bear up and grit their teeth and deal with pain, like without complaining about it or without like taking too many painkillers, because that would make them sort of seem weak and unmanly. So I started finding, when I was researching this side of the story, I started finding examples of Civil War soldiers that wanted opiate painkillers, but they also worried that if they took too many, it would make them seem less manly. Then it would make them seem less than manly because they needed like relief from the pain. So it's an interesting example of sort of how gender, like how ideas about manhood interacted with Civil War veterans.
And since you've touched on morality already, it reminds me in that anesthesia research that I was doing, Stonewall Jackson talks about going under and how he was at first religiously opposed to the use of anesthetics. And even after he'd gotten it and called it an infinite blessing and sang its praises, he's like, yeah, but I wouldn't want to go to my maker under the influence of anesthetics. Do you see similar religious approaches to opioids and the use of opioids?
Yeah, that kind of commentary is really interesting to me, because I found this one example of a Civil War, a Confederate soldier. His name, I can't remember his name at the moment, but this guy who had endured like a really terrible gunshot wound, a mortal gunshot wound. But it took him a long time to die. It took him a couple of weeks to die from it. And in the hospital, he had to, sort of die a certain way, something that the historian Drew Gilpin Faust is called the good death, right? So it's like you were expected on your deathbed to behave in a certain way so that you could sort of pass on peacefully and like pass on in the way that you were supposed to die. Which imagine, you're like suffering from terrible pain, but yet you're expected to act a certain way and to sort of grit your teeth and deal with it. But anyways, I found this one example of a Confederate soldier who wanted to like do the different things that you were supposed to do when you were dying. Like he wanted to sing hymns, he wanted to write letters to his mom, he wanted to say, goodbye to his fellow soldiers, but the pain was so bad from his gunshot wound that he couldn't. So he actually asked for some morphine so that he could then go and do those things. So after he got a dose of morphine, he started singing hymns and like doing the things that you were supposed to do right before you die. So it's a really interesting connection there between those ideas, like religious ideas and morphine.
So
yeah.
Sorry about that. Having trouble with my speaker there. I do have a question, kind of swinging us away from the moral questions and more to the kind of practical. What was, and I know we talked a little bit about this already, but we have a question here from David Welker. What was the most common delivery system of opium during the conflict?
Yeah, in the Civil War, the 4 years of the Civil War, it would have been an opium pill. And it wouldn't have just been, it wasn't just straight opium. Usually it was compounded with various different other drugs, right? So the most common one was opium and camphor mixed together. There were, so for example, historians have actually sat down and counted the number of opiates that the Union Army requisitioned during the Civil War. And the Union Army purchased anywhere between 5 million and 10 million opium pills. So there were just lots and lots of opium pills floating around Union Army hospitals. And that was the most common delivery. The second most common would have been actually not morphine shots, but laudanum liquid opiates to swallow. So opium pills, liquid opium, followed by morphine injections. And morphine injections were actually a lot more common in sort of the bigger hospitals, the ones that were behind the lines. If you were a Civil War soldier, like in a camp or a field hospital, chances are you would have more likely than not been given an opium pill. But if you were sent back behind the lines to like Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., where these big hospitals were, then you start to see a lot of morphine injections.
Today's opiate crisis is broken down along class and racial lines.
Right.
Do we see the same thing back then, or is it kind of a cross-section of society?
There were, so before the Civil War, most people that were addicted to opiates were actually women. And in particular, white sort of middle and upper class women, because that's who doctors did most of the opiate prescribing to. So during the Civil War, for the first time, you start to see that that gender ratio change as more and more Civil War soldiers or men became addicted to opiates. So you started to see a lot of male opiate addicts after that point. And after the Civil War, it was there were still more women than men addicted to opium, but it was a lot more even, that ratio, than it had been earlier in the 19th century. The interesting thing, though, is that you don't see a lot of, immediately after the Civil War, you don't see a lot of African-American soldiers who became addicted to opiates. And the reason is actually really troubling. According to 19th century ideas about pain, it was, and sort of like race science of the day, race science, things that modern science dispels. But according to sort of the ideas about science that 19th century doctors bought into, it was thought that African Americans were less sensitive to pain, therefore they didn't need opiate painkillers. And that translated to a lower rate of addiction among African American soldiers. And you see similar patterns actually in today's opioid crisis. So you see a really troubling legacy of the same kind of thing happening today.
And that kind of brings us around to our mission. The mission of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine is to make lessons of the past mean something for today, to draw that direct line of what can we learn from the past. So I'm glad you brought that up. Real quick, I also want to remind our audience that these programs are free. We're going to keep doing them throughout this. We're going to continue them after everyone gets to come and actually see our museum again, after we're all able to be in person and not over Zoom. We're still going to be doing these live streams. And if you want to support us, do consider a membership. Memberships are the best way to support us. You can get that in the comments or at our website, civilwarmed.org. But going back, do you see any geographic barriers too? Were Southerners or Northerners more likely to be addicted, or was that not really a thing?
So I expected, during the war, there was a major Union blockade that really caused really serious medical supply shortages in the last 2 or 3 years of the Civil War. One of the drugs that was really in short supply in the Confederate Army and in Confederate hospitals was morphine. If you read Confederate surgeons' diaries and their requests for like supplies and stuff, you see this just acute morphine shortage in a lot of places, especially in Virginia. So I expected that to translate into a lower rate of addiction among Confederate soldiers, but I found that in reality that didn't happen, that Northern and Southern veterans were about as likely as each other to become addicted. So the medical supplies started flowing into the South pretty quickly again after the Civil War. So again, I expected there to be this sort of geographic disparity, but there wasn't, and I found that really surprising, really striking.
So I want to go over to the chat section here, which we have a fantastic chat going on. Lots of questions being asked and answered in the comment section of the video. Thank you all so much for joining in the conversation. And there are lots of questions in here, and we're going to try to get to some of them at the end as we kind of work through the progression of Jonathan's research and some of the pre-scheduled questions that we have here. And then once we get a little further along, we'll start to flip over to some of your audience questions. I see some of them have been answered already. We might come back to them anyway to get Jonathan's take on them as well. But I did want to, as we're starting to head away from the Civil War itself and into the aftermath of the war, we did have a question here that I think is going to be in an area, territory that we're going to start to head to. Barbara, this is a question that came in earlier, wanted to know, what about smoking opium?
Great question. Yeah. So one of the when we think opium in the 19th century, usually our minds jump to smoking opium, right? A lot of the media coverage about opiate addiction in the late 1800s focused on this like big opium smoking, supposed problem that existed in places on the West Coast, like San Francisco, and supposedly moved eastward as you get closer to the year 1900. The interesting thing is, though, is that opium smoking mainly occurred among a certain subset of Americans, and those were immigrants from China. It wasn't until very late in the 19th century, the last 2 decades of the 1800s, that opium smoking, non-immigrant Americans started to smoke opium. So the vast majority of opiate addiction in the 19th century among Civil War soldiers and Civil War veterans was through like opium pills and morphine injections. But that's a really, really great question. It's actually a different kind of preparation of opium that is smokable. So they're sort of, they're both called opium, but they're almost 2 different kinds of opium too.
Right.
And along with that, actually, I do want to make a couple of book recommendations. You mentioned the supposed push west of opiate addiction and linking that to Chinese immigration. Freedom's Frontier, just finished reading that one. It's a great book about racial hierarchies in the far west that sort of overlaps and goes into Reconstruction. Do you have any books that you can recommend, or are there any books that you can recommend about opiate addiction in the 19th century?
There are, I wish I could plug my own book here. So if you ask me that question in a year or two, I'll be like, oh, my book. I'm working on it. I'm almost there. There are surprisingly very few histories of opiate addiction in the 19th century US. For the longest time, it was assumed that opiate addiction was only a more modern problem. There's one really great book by the historian David Courtwright, and his work has been really influential in my own work. He's a really fun scholar to talk to. The book is called Dark Paradise. And it came out sometime I think it came out in 1981. Again, that's David Courtwright, Dark Paradise, a history of opiate addiction in America, to 1920 or something like that. That's a really great book. But other than that, the research has been really sparse. I have an article coming out in the Journal of the Civil War Era here in just a couple of weeks. And I believe that when it gets put up on JSTOR and Project Muse, the 2 databases, that for the time being, it'll be free. So anybody that wants to read more about this can look up that article, and I think you can read it for free. It's called Opium Slavery, Civil War Veterans and Opiate Addiction. And it looks at various facets of the phenomenon.
So we have another good question here. Lots of great questions coming in from the audience. We have about 106 people watching right now, which is fantastic. Thank you all so much for tuning in with us. If you are enjoying, hit that like button, hit the share button, and become a member or a donor of the museum and support these videos. Question here from Sharita, who is a longtime viewer of our videos, and that is, what therapy, if any, was offered to opium addicts?
That's another great question. Before the Civil War, there were not a lot of therapies for opiate addiction. Doctors knew that people became addicted to opiates, but there wasn't really much that you could do to treat a patient that came into your office with an opium addiction, except just cold turkey, have them stop taking opium or laudanum or whatever form of the drug that they're taking. When that happens, when opium, when a person's body is used to opium and then all of a sudden it's discontinued, there are horrible side effects that go into that. Withdrawal is really dangerous, really unpleasant. And so when large numbers of Civil War veterans started to become addicted to the drug, and they sort of started searching for medical care for their addictions, American doctors had to come up with a way to treat addiction, and they had to do it fast. So there were a couple of different things that they developed late in the 19th century to supposedly cure opiate addiction. And these are really fun to talk about because a lot of them are what were called patent medicines. And these were basically like cure-all medicines that you could buy through the mail or at a pharmacy that had really shady ingredients. So for example, one of my favorite characters to write about or talk about is this guy called Samuel B. Collins, who was a Civil War veteran himself, actually, who realized that lots of other Civil War veterans, lots of his colleagues, his friends, had become addicted to opiates, and he spotted a business opportunity. Collins was like, hey, maybe I can make some money if I develop a medicine that purports to cure opiate addiction. So he did. He named it. The name is just priceless. He called it Samuel B. Collins Painless Opium Antidote. And it would supposedly cure your opiate addiction if you purchased a month's supply. And it was relatively expensive for the 19th century. It was like $30 a month. He made a fortune. He made a lot of money off of it. It turns out that it actually had opium in it. So he was treating opium with opium. So that didn't work so well. But physicians also developed various different therapies. The first American drug rehab centers, the first clinics that you could go to and receive decent medical care for drug addiction, were developed in part to treat Civil War veterans. And so what would happen in those clinics is that basically the doctors would reduce your opiate dose. So every day you would take a little bit less morphine until you were successfully over your addiction.
Excellent. So we have another question here that I would like to address. This kind of relates to our site, the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum in DC. We do have a question from a ways back about Clara Barton and her role in, did she give out medicines like opium, that sort of thing? As far as we know, likely the opium was probably included amongst the goods that she was carrying to battlefields like Antietam, like Fredericksburg, down south in South Carolina, after the Wilderness in Spotsylvania, and at the Battle of Petersburg. So Clara Barton was very much involved in this. She is in the operating room, at least on one occasion at Antietam. She is in close proximity to field hospitals at other battlefields. So chances are she was getting her kind of hands on a lot of these medications, a lot of the things that we have been talking about today. So Jonathan, I have a question for you here from our list. And I always like to kind of, as we get away from the talking about the kind of clinical, talking about kind of the research that you've had and how it kind of all fits into this narrative about opiates in the Civil War. And I want to kind of get to you as the historian and dig a little deeper here. And I always like asking this: what is something that surprised you over the course of your research into this topic?
I was really surprised to find out that most 19th century American doctors and a lot of 19th century Americans thought of opiate addiction as like a form of insanity, as like a form of mental illness. It was in today, according to modern medicine, opioid addiction isn't necessarily seen as a type of insanity, but in the 19th century, because they sort of lacked a modern understanding of how the brain chemistry operates with opioids and like how that side of addiction works. They basically chalked up opiate addiction to mental illness. If somebody was addicted, chances are, especially earlier in the 19th century, they would be labeled as like crazy or insane, and they would be shunted off to a mental asylum. So I found just a ton of Civil War veterans and other people addicted to opiates that were locked up for years or even decades in mental hospitals because of their opiate addictions, and that really surprised me. And the asylums, I think it kind of goes without saying, but the asylums were really unpleasant places. They were oftentimes quite dangerous to live in. Disease was rampant in many of these asylums. And so it could be really quite bad if you were suffering from an opiate addiction. You ran afoul of, a doctor or somebody had you committed, and then you got stuck in an asylum for a long time. That was really dangerous. So not only were you suffering from addiction, but then you were exposed to illness and violence and all kinds of other things that happened in these asylums.
Kyle, you have any other questions for Jonathan?
Yeah, I think actually one that kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about the importance of history, the power of history, and how we need to take lessons away from it. While certainly we're not quite as backward as the treatment was back then, we do still have our own issues. Addiction is often linked to morality. People talk about draconian measures against the addicts themselves. What's a lesson that you think is most important, or at least very important, that we can take away from your research?
That's a great question. I think this is one of the issues that I struggled with as I was conceiving the project and doing the research and then writing it. I'm writing about a historical opioid crisis in the middle of an opioid crisis. So like, how do I what do I do? Do I look at the past through the present? Do I look at the present through the past? How does that work? And in the process of doing the project, there are like several parallels that became obvious to me that I think are really important. And so this is sort of how I conclude my project, is pointing these things out. Today's opioid crisis was in large part caused by medicine. And I'm a big proponent of medicine. Like if I'm sick, I want, give me some medicine, right? Give me some antibiotics or whatever, right? But in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, opioids were vastly overprescribed for a variety of reasons. A lot of opioid manufacturers, like drug companies, for example, lied and said that things like OxyContin were not addictive, when in reality, as we know today, they are. And so, anyways, the point is that our current opioid crisis was in large part caused by the ways that doctors prescribed opiates. It was the same thing in the Civil War. The majority of Civil War veterans that became addicted to opiates developed addiction to opiate medicines. They weren't sort of looking to get high or looking to check out of reality through drugs. They were being treated medically, and they became addicted to medicines. So that's something that I think that in the future, if we're to sort of stave off these recurrent opioid crises in US history, we need to not forget that. Like, we need to remember that prescription medicines can lead to addiction. It's a problem that we need to keep our finger on if we're going to keep it from reaching epidemic levels like it did after the Civil War and like it has recently.
Very, very well said, Jonathan. I have another question here. This one's from Mike, who has similar interests to me. He wants to know if you could talk about your research methods and where you were conducting most of your research.
Absolutely, yeah. I could go on and on for days about this. So opiate addiction is something that, because it was so taboo in the 19th century, it was something that 19th century Americans were hesitant to talk about openly. So you can find traces of opiate addiction in sort of the normal sources that Civil War historians use. You can find occasionally a diary that mentions it, or a letter, or maybe a newspaper column in the New York Times. But I struggled to find enough of those sources to be able to piece together a whole book, right? And so what I started doing after I realized that opiate addiction could land people in mental asylums, that's where I started looking to try to uncover the experience of drug addiction and sort of what it meant for people's lives. So I've spent a lot of time looking at the medical records that were generated by mental hospitals in the 1800s. So for example, in New York, which is where I live, I'm lucky through no planning of my own. I just kind of happened to it was pure happenstance. I stumbled into a collection of archival materials at the New York State Archives, which is just a few hours away from my apartment here in Ithaca. And they happen to be some of the best preserved 19th century mental asylum records. They're really detailed clinical notes. Doctors described the background of the patients. They described the medical care that they received for their addictions. And they also, if you sort of read between the lines, described sort of how they thought about their patients. And that gave me a window into how opiate addiction was seen by 19th century Americans. And what I discovered were a lot of the aspects of it that we've talked about, like the fact that it was taboo, the fact that it made men seem less than manly if they were addicted, et cetera, et cetera. Those records are hard to come by. So I've been all over the country sort of scouring for these mental asylum records in places like New York. I've spent a lot of time in North Carolina, Virginia. And so these records have just been a real gold mine for me.
That makes me think, I know that we were, shortly after you came to speak at the museum, we kind of had an exchange back and forth, and we found a trove of, I can't remember how many prescriptions that were in our collection at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And we realized through reading what the medications were that most of them had contained opiates of some kind, which was kind of sobering just to realize that many of them came in those, as you mentioned earlier, the pill forms and those sorts of things. So in some cases, it seems like, those of us who have been working with Civil War medicine quite a bit, you might have been talking about opium and morphine related drugs and not even realize what you were talking about when you're talking about things like I think Dover's powder was one of them that I saw. This goes back to, I promise there's a point to this. This goes back to a question from a friend of mine who I worked with at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park back in 2015, John Lanius. Hi, John, I hope you're still watching. And he asked about some of the dosage and what was the kind of, did medical professionals have a standard dosage that they were using during the Civil War?
That's another really great question. I have absolutely no medical or pharmacy training whatsoever, so it was it was tricky for me to figure this out. And oftentimes, medical records like those prescriptions that you mentioned at the museum were written in Latin, so I had to learn sort of basic pharmacy Latin, which was its own whole thing. But yes, eventually doctors did settle on sort of standardized dosages for opiates. The problem is that they don't easily translate into modern dosages, right? So when we take morphine or are prescribed morphine or any kind of opioid, they're usually in milligrams. But in the 19th century, doctors prescribed medicines oftentimes in what were called grains, which is its own unit of measurement. So if you convert those, you can tell how many milligrams a person was getting. The tricky part is that doctors didn't always very carefully describe how they were using opiates. So if you read Civil War surgical manuals, for example, like manuals that were intended to teach Civil War surgeons who oftentimes joined the army without a lot of experience on their own, to teach them how to prescribe medicines, usually they're really vague about how much to actually give a patient. So you'll read descriptions of when you're performing a surgery, give 15 to 20 drops of opium or a little opium, maybe some morphine. And you can see how that would translate into overdose. So overdose was another common concern among doctors because they weren't really told very well how much opium to give. So there was a process of trial and error there too.
So another question here from the comments section. I'm sorry, these kind of bounce all over the place. So I'm trying to get them to connect to this larger narrative that we're going along. But I'm going to go back to the some of the asylum comments, and we had a question here. Did you see any connection between the use of opiates and the use of other drugs? Thinking specifically alcohol. Was there any connection that you saw in some of the research that you've done?
Absolutely, yeah. Opiates and alcohol were commonly mixed together in the 19th century. So one of the medicines, one of the major forms of opiates was laudanum, and it's actually opium mixed with alcohol. But even beyond that, people who oftentimes individuals that were addicted to alcohol or whiskey would attempt to go off of the whiskey and onto opium, which for a while in the 19th century, people thought was less dangerous than alcohol. So there was a lot of sort of overlap between whiskey addiction or alcohol addiction and opiate addiction. So in the asylums, for example, I found scores of Civil War veterans who were described as both being addicted to morphine and whiskey at the same time. So it was pretty common.
Did you see any translation between society's views of alcohol addiction and opioid addiction? Were they seen differently? Were they kind of viewed the same way?
This is a really interesting question, and this sort of gets into the cultural history of drug addiction that I bring out in my manuscript and in the article that I mentioned that's coming out here in a couple of weeks. So in the 19th century, there's leading up to Prohibition in the 1920s, there was this century-long anti-alcohol movement, the temperance movement, and there were all of these sort of cultural beliefs about or cultural baggage about alcohol abuse that were really, really strong. So alcohol abuse was stigmatized. The interesting thing is that even though there were these sort of parallel concerns about opiate abuse, And there was some overlap between people that were alarmed about alcohol abuse and those people that were worried about opium abuse. Not all of those cultural baggages transferred from alcohol to opium. So for example, alcohol was seen as primarily like a men's problem. It was something that afflicted men in the 19th century. But until after the Civil War, so for most of the 19th century, opiate abuse was seen as a women's problem. So sort of like mirror images of each other, if that makes sense. And I'll just add that really affected the idea before the Civil War that opiate addiction was primarily a women's problem, affected how society perceived Civil War veterans, who were all men, who became addicted to opiates. They were seen as less manly, in part because opiate addiction was seen as a woman's problem. So it's a really interesting thread to sort of follow in the story.
So I have a good question here. This actually relates to something that we had gotten asked about before this video, which is about medical marijuana in the Civil War, because we're going to talk about drug usage during the Civil War. Inevitably, it seems that marijuana was going to come up. This comes up from this question comes from a good friend of mine, Rich Condon, who runs Civil War Pittsburgh. Hello, Rich. Thanks for watching. He said that he's read of brandy being mixed with cannabis in one case. Have you found other instances of these kinds of concoctions being used in the field?
I have, yeah. Not so much during the Civil War, although it's possible that if I were to look specifically for cannabis in Civil War prescriptions, that I might find it. I don't know quite the answer to that, but definitely after the Civil War. Cannabis was a common treatment for opiate addiction, believe it or not. Doctors didn't know. All of a sudden, after the Civil War, they were faced with a huge influx of patients who were addicted to opiates, but they didn't necessarily have for a long time a good treatment for it. And one of the things that they experimented with was cannabis indica or cannabis. And so, for example, there was this one doctor, his name I'm blanking out on his name, but I looked at his prescription records at one of these drug addiction clinics where patients would come to him and he would cure them of drug addiction. He treated a lot of them with cannabis. And I have no idea what happened to these patients afterward. I don't know if they continued to use cannabis, but definitely it was seen as a valid medical treatment for opiate addiction in the 19th century.
Yeah, there's one other comment I want to make on that is, in recently I was reading a letter collection, an edited letter collection by Jonathan White, who spoke about dreams in the Civil War with us a few weeks back. But in one of the collections that he pulled together from Philadelphia, huge Pennsylvania Civil War fan, so reading Civil War Diary from Pennsylvania and Philadelphia is on brand for me. And I'm reading through it, and I got to this section. I think it was from like November of 1863, and the person who was writing the diary. In this case, it was a diary collection. He was suffering from gout and had terrible gout. And he writes that his doctor had given him cannabis. And he said he could not have thought of a more pleasant way to cure gout. And it's just like, oh, that is just, it was just a kind of a funny thing to come across of like, reading just somebody's normal everyday life and where it intersects with medicine and with drugs in this era. And I think it's, as you kind of talked about, these kinds of drugs, especially opium, were so common during the war and during the 19th century that you can see all of these intersections with just, everyday life, everyday people coming across and intersecting with opium. And that I imagine could have potentially dangerous consequences.
Absolutely, yeah. It's important to remember that there were almost no restrictions whatsoever on narcotics, on dangerous sort of medicines in the 19th century. It wasn't until way late in the 1890s when states like New York first started trying to put regulations on what kinds of medicines that you could buy and sell. And then in 1914 was the first federal regulation on like opium and morphine. So, I mean, if you wanted morphine, you could just go to the store and buy it. It was that simple. And naturally, there were lots of accidents. So if you read coroner's records from 19th century cities like New York, you'll see that there were lots of opiate or opioid overdose deaths. And that's another parallel between past and present.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like this epidemic begins before the Civil War. Civil War accelerates it and also changes the dynamic, makes it much more male. Does that epidemic ever really come to an end, and how?
That's a great question. It's kind of a dark, I have kind of a dark answer. So before the Civil War, and this is sort of the basic narrative or the plot that I tell in my my broader study. Before the Civil War, opiate addiction was, known in 19th century America. It happened, doctors were concerned about it, but it hadn't reached sort of epidemic, like, red alert, this is a really big problem kind of levels. Immediately after the Civil War, the late 1860s, 1870s, that's when it became what I call America's original opioid crisis. Like the first sort of media storm about opiate addiction occurred immediately following the Civil War. And it extended through about the 1890s. The interesting thing though is that as you get closer to the year 1900, you started to see less and less Civil War veterans among the broader population of opiate addicted Americans, and more other kinds of people, like younger people who weren't alive during the Civil War. Different stereotypes about who the typical addict was started to form towards the year 1900. So essentially the Civil War veterans opiate addiction epidemic kind of slowly, gradually transformed into a different kind of opioid crisis, right? And there have been, for example, the book that I mentioned by David Courtwright, there have been a few studies of sort of this second wave of opiate addiction in the 19th century to things like heroin and smoking opium, for example. So essentially the short answer to the question is that basically the Civil War era opiate addiction crisis ended when Civil War veterans started to die in large numbers of opiate addictions. And that was sort of in the 1880s and 1890s. I will add though that I have seen cases of Civil War veterans who lived with opiate addictions into the 1910s and 1920s. And this is where I end my story. You would think that, a person couldn't live for 50 years with an opiate addiction, but it turns out that they can. And so, for example, in Louisiana, in the mid 1920s, there was a clinic called a morphine maintenance clinic that existed to try to, it was an experimental way to try to cure morphine and heroin addiction. The records of that clinic has a Civil War, a Confederate veteran who had been addicted since like the Battle of Gettysburg, which was more than 50 years before. So this guy lived his entire life having to take morphine, 1, 2, multiple times a day. I just can't imagine what that was like. So it is ultimately a tragedy, the story that I tell. Like it ends, with a lot of Civil War veterans dying of opioid addictions. Most of them did not overcome the problem that the Civil War sort of left them with.
So as we're starting to run a little low on time here, have a few minutes left, and we've been asking this kind of final question for a lot of those that we've interviewed. Thank you again so much for being here today and for being willing to talk about this incredible research that you're doing. What is the future for your research? I know you talked about a book possible in the future. Can you tell the audience, what they can expect from historian, soon to be Dr. Jonathan Jones in the future?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I am actually working on this project in book form now. It's crazy because I've spent 3 years with this as a dissertation, and now I'm starting to think of it as a book. So hopefully in the near future, this will be published in book form and you'll be able to buy it then. So stay tuned on that. Keep a lookout for that. I'm really lucky to have gotten good institutional support for this. After starting in July of this year, I'll be headed down to Penn State, where I'll be a postdoc at Penn State's Richard Civil War Era Center, and I'll just be exclusively publishing this book. I'll be working on that. After that, after I leave Penn State, I'll be headed to the Virginia Military Institute, where I'll teach the Civil War. And I'm playing around with a couple of different ideas of what to work on then. One of the projects that I have in mind is about the Civil War and insanity. As I mentioned, opiate addiction was seen as a form of insanity. So in the process of like digging around through these, the records of mental asylums, I found lots and lots of cases of Civil War veterans that suffered from other forms of insanity. So I'm envisioning a project that uses those records as well. So a similar sort of project to this.
Excellent. Well, we all look forward to that and to seeing what's going to come from Jonathan Jones in the future. This has been a fantastic conversation. I want to thank you again, Jonathan, so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
Yeah, certainly. And remember, everybody out there, that if you like these programs, you want to see more like it, be sure to support us. Find that link in the comments. The best way to support us is becoming a member. Gets you discounts in our gift shop, free admission once we're open again, and especially now while our doors are closed and have been for a very long time. That's a great way to make sure these can keep coming. So donate, become a member. These are the best ways to keep these coming. Again, thank you so much. Soon to be Dr. Jones.
Thanks.
And thank you all out there for watching. I hope you have a great week, and we will be back with you tomorrow. I'm going to be putting up a new event that's going to be happening tomorrow at 4 p.m. We'll see you then, and we'll also see you on Wednesday and Friday this week. So lots of videos coming out. Hope to see you all then. If you didn't get a chance to catch this live, it will be on our Facebook and YouTube channels as well, so you can catch it whenever you like. Think of it as, pay-per-view. If you become a member and a donor, you'll be supporting these videos, and they're going to be there for you whenever you want to access them. So thank you all so much for watching. Have a great day.